Get her out, right now. I don't care who she is. General Carter's voice cut through Facility B like a blade. Every officer froze. Nobody breathed. A 23-year-old staff sergeant was standing beside the most restricted sniper rifle on the base, hands on the weapon, eyes calm, unmoved as a 4-star general with 33 years of command bore down on her with the full weight of his authority. He stopped 2 feet from her face. Who authorized you to touch that rifle? She looked straight at him. No hesitation, no apology. No fear. I authorized myself, sir. The room went absolutely silent. And General Carter had no idea he was standing in front of the most dangerous soldier he had ever met. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The morning started the way most mornings at Raven Peak Military Base started: cold, quiet, and ordered. Raven Peak sat high in the Colorado Rockies, a facility that blended into the mountain terrain so completely that civilian hikers sometimes passed within 2 miles of it without ever knowing it existed. It was not a flashy base. It was not the kind of place where soldiers came to be seen. It was the kind of place where serious people did serious work, and where careers were either built into legends or quietly buried beneath paperwork. By 6:15 in the morning, the base was already running. Boots on pavement, voices in hallways, the low mechanical hum of a facility waking itself up for another day of operations. General William Carter arrived at the main building at exactly 6:22. He was never late. In 33 years of military service, the man had developed habits so precise that staff used to joke quietly, carefully, out of earshot, that you could set your watch by the general's footsteps. Carter was 61 years old, 4 stars on his collar, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains surrounding the base. He had survived 2 wars, 4 major field operations, and enough bureaucratic battles in Washington to fill a second career. He was not a man who was easily surprised. He was not a man who was easily impressed. And he was absolutely not a man who tolerated surprises before his first cup of coffee. His aide, Lieutenant James Ortega, met him at the entrance with a briefing tablet and a look on his face that Carter had learned, over many years, to associate with problems. "Good morning, sir," Ortega. Carter took the tablet without breaking stride. "What do I need to know?" Ortega hesitated, just a fraction of a second. But Carter noticed everything. "There's a situation in the restricted weapons bay, sir." Facility B. Carter stopped walking. He turned and looked at Ortega with a particular kind of stillness that experienced soldiers had learned to treat as a warning signal. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. Something that came before anger, the way the air goes completely silent in the seconds before a storm. "What kind of situation?" Ortega cleared his throat. "One of the temporary assignment personnel, sir, a staff sergeant. She was found inside the restricted room this morning, in contact with the Barrett M82A1. Carter stared at him for a moment. Then he handed the tablet back. "Show me." The walk to Facility B took 4 minutes. Carter covered it in 3. When he pushed through the heavy security door and stepped into the weapons bay, the scene was exactly what Ortega had described, and somehow still worse than he had imagined. A room full of officers and technicians, all standing with the careful, practiced stillness of people who had decided the safest thing to do was absolutely nothing. And in the middle of all that stillness, standing beside the Barrett M82A1, with her hands resting lightly on the rifle's receiver, was a young woman. She was small. That was the first thing Carter registered. Not fragile, not weak, but compact in the way that serious athletes sometimes are. Like every part of her had been built for function rather than appearance. Her uniform was pressed and clean. Her dark hair was pulled back precisely beneath her patrol cap. And the expression on her face was not the expression of someone who had been caught doing something wrong. She looked, Carter thought, with a cold flash of irritation, almost calm. He walked directly toward her. The other personnel in the room found things to look at on the floor, the ceiling, the walls, anywhere but the trajectory between the general and the young sergeant. Carter stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough to make most soldiers take an involuntary step backward. She didn't move. He looked at her rank insignia, Staff Sergeant. Temporary assignment patch on her shoulder, and then, and this was the thing that caught his eye and held it, a small badge on her uniform that he didn't immediately recognize. Not because it was obscure, but because the number on it was so far outside the range of anything he expected to see on a temporary assignment soldier that his brain took an extra beat to process it. 3,200. He pulled his attention back to her face. "Who authorized you?" he said. And his voice was the carefully controlled voice of a man who had spent decades learning to weaponize quiet. to touch that rifle. The young soldier looked at him. Her eyes were steady, not defiant, not afraid. Just steady, the way the mountains outside were steady, like she had been standing in this exact spot, in this exact posture, for years. I authorized myself, sir. The temperature in the room dropped approximately 10 degrees. Somewhere behind Carter, someone inhaled sharply. He didn't turn around to see who. He kept his eyes on her face. You authorized yourself. Yes, sir, your name. Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes, sir. Temporarily assigned from... I know what temporarily assigned means, Sergeant. Carter's voice was still quiet, still controlled. But there was something beneath the control now, something that the officers in the room could feel, even if they couldn't see it. What I want you to explain to me is how a staff sergeant on temporary assignment decided that she had the authority to enter a restricted facility and handle a classified piece of equipment without authorization from anyone above her rank. Emily Hayes did not look at the floor. She did not look at the walls. She kept her eyes on Carter's face, with an expression that he was finding increasingly difficult to categorize. The rifle had a scope alignment issue, sir. I detected it during the equipment review briefing yesterday and wanted to verify the problem before filing a maintenance report. Carter stared at her. A scope alignment issue, yes, sir. And you detected this during a briefing? Yes, sir. Not from a hands-on inspection? No, sir. From the range footage that Colonel Whitmore showed during the debrief, the impact pattern suggested a micro-deviation in the reticle calibration. I wanted to confirm before reporting it formally. Carter turned his head. Colonel Whitmore was standing approximately 6 feet to his left, with the expression of a man who was deeply regretting every decision he had made that had led to this particular morning. Whitmore, sir, run a full inspection on that rifle. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Carter turned back to Emily Hayes. Step away from the weapon, Sergeant. She stepped back. No hesitation. No drama. Carter crossed the room and picked up the radio from the wall mount. He pressed the call button for his chief of security. I want a complete background file on Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes pulled and on my desk in 20 minutes. Everything we have. He released the button and turned back to the room. Everyone else clear the facility. The room emptied so fast it almost looked choreographed. Carter was left alone with Lieutenant Ortega and the rifle. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the Barrett M82A1. It was a beautiful weapon, in the way that extremely functional things are sometimes beautiful not because of how it looked, but because of what it was capable of. At the right range, in the right hands, it could reach out across distances that most people thought of as abstract rather than real. He looked at the badge on Emily Hayes' uniform again in his memory. 3,200 meters. He had seen long-range marksmanship badges before. He had decorated soldiers himself for confirmed shots at ranges that civilian populations would have called impossible. But 3,200 meters was not a number that appeared in normal service records. It was not a number that appeared in most classified records. It was a number that sat at the outer edge of what was theoretically achievable, a number that belonged to a very shortcut list of confirmed engagements that the military did not discuss in public briefings. And it was sitting on the uniform of a 23-year-old staff sergeant on temporary assignment who had just told him she authorized herself to enter a restricted weapons bay because she detected a scope misalignment from range footage during a briefing. Carter picked up the radio again. Ortega, get Reed. Captain Michael Reed arrived at Carter's office 11 minutes later. He was 41 years old, built like someone who had never once in his life taken the easy option, and he had a face that showed exactly as much emotion as he decided it should show, which was usually very little. Reed had spent 8 years in Special Forces before moving into advisory operations. He had worked with some of the most elite marksmen in the United States military. He was not easily impressed, which was precisely why Carter wanted his opinion. Carter slid the preliminary file across the desk without speaking. Reed sat down, opened it, and read. He read for 4 minutes. Carter watched him. When Reed finally looked up, his expression had shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, but Carter knew his face well enough to read it. Where did this come from? Reed asked. That's the file on the soldier who was found in Facility B this morning. Reed looked back down at the file. Most of this is redacted. Yes, the sections that are redacted are the sections that would explain the badge. Yes, Reed set the file down. He leaned back in his chair. General, I've been in this business for a long time. I've worked with some genuinely exceptional people. Sniper teams, long-range specialists, operators whose files you can't pull without a 4-level clearance. He paused. I've never seen a confirmed 3,200-meter first-round hit. Not from any of them. Neither have I, Carter said. So either that badge is wrong or it isn't. Reed was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? Carter leaned forward. I want to know if it's real, and I want to know who this soldier actually is. He tapped the file. Because right now, all I have is redactions, a badge I can't explain, and a 23-year-old who walked into my restricted weapons bay and told me she authorized herself. Reed looked at the file again. Then he looked at Carter. You want a demonstration? I want the truth, Carter said. A demonstration would be a way of getting it. Reed nodded slowly. I'll tell you what I think before we go any further, sir. I think that badge is an error or an exaggeration. I've seen it before, records that get inflated somewhere in the classification process, numbers that get attached to soldiers who were present for something rather than responsible for it. A 3,200-meter confirmed hit is not. He stopped himself. Chose his next words carefully. It's not something I'm prepared to accept without seeing it. Then we'll see it, Carter said. Set up the range. That afternoon, while the range preparation was being organized, Carter did something he hadn't done in years. He went back to Facility B alone and stood in front of the Barrett M82A1. His chief armorer, a master sergeant named Kowalski, had already completed the inspection Carter ordered. Kowalski was waiting for him in the hallway outside. What did you find? Carter asked. Kowalski had been working with weapons systems for 22 years. He was the kind of man who talked about rifle components the way other men talked about old friends, with familiarity, with affection, and with the absolute certainty of someone who had spent decades learning to read the smallest signs. There's a microdeviation in the reticle calibration, sir. Approximately 0.003 degrees of lateral drift. It would be invisible to almost any standard inspection. Carter looked at him. Invisible to almost any standard inspection. Yes, sir, I've been doing this for 22 years. I found it with specialized equipment. The deviation would cause a missed shot or a very slightly imprecise shot at extreme distances. At standard ranges, you'd never know it was there. Carter was quiet for a moment. How long has it been there? Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be longer. And Sergeant Hayes found it. From footage, apparently, sir. From range footage during a briefing. Kowalski paused. I have to be honest with you, General. That's not something I would have expected to be possible. The kind of eye that catches a 0.003-degree drift from video footage. He shook his head slowly. That's a different category of perception. Carter thanked him and stood alone in the hallway for a long time. He thought about what it meant to judge something before you understood it. He had spent 33 years in the United States military. He had learned, through hard experience, that the most dangerous assumptions were the ones that felt the most reasonable. The ones that were built on real experience and genuine expertise and still managed to be completely wrong. He had looked at Emily Hayes and seen a young soldier who had broken protocol. He had seen her rank, her age, her appearance. He had not seen the badge. He had seen the badge, and he had not let himself believe it. That was a choice, and choices had consequences. Later that evening, Carter requested to see Emily Hayes in his office. She arrived 7 minutes early. She knocked once, waited for the acknowledgement, and entered with the precise, unhurried movement of someone who had spent years learning to be completely present in any room she walked into. Carter gestured to the chair across the desk. She sat down. He looked at her for a moment, not the way he had looked at her in the weapons bay, not with that controlled, weaponized patience. This was a different kind of looking. He was trying to see something he had missed. Tell me about the rifle, he said. The scope deviation? Yes. Emily folded her hands in her lap. At extreme range, anything beyond 2,000 meters, a 0.003-degree lateral drift in the reticle becomes the difference between a hit and a miss. The bullet's travel time at that distance is long enough that even a fractional misalignment compounded by environmental variables changes everything. She paused. I saw the impact pattern in the footage from the last qualification shoot. The grouping was off by a consistent margin in one direction. Not random scatter, consistent. That tells you it's equipment, not technique. Carter leaned back. You said you authorized yourself. Yes, sir. Why those words specifically? Emily looked at him steadily. Because they're accurate. No one authorized me. I made the decision. I stand behind it. She paused. I understand it violated protocol. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequence you determine is appropriate. But the rifle had a problem. Someone needed to verify it. I verified it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. Carter studied her face. He was looking for something: performance, calculation, the micro-expressions of someone managing an impression. He didn't find them. What he found instead was something that took him a moment to name. Simplicity, not simplicity as in simple-minded, simplicity as in uncomplicated. As in someone who had been so thoroughly tested by real experience that all the extra layers, the performance, the positioning, the social machinery that most people use to navigate rooms full of authority had been stripped away. What remained was just the truth, and complete comfort with saying it. Your record is classified, Carter said. Most of it, sir. The parts that aren't classified don't explain the badge. No, sir, they wouldn't. I'd like to understand how you earned it. Emily was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone choosing what to reveal. The quiet of someone deciding how to explain something that was difficult to explain. There's a mission in my record, she said finally. I can't tell you the specifics. What I can tell you is that at 19 years old, I was in a position where people I was responsible for were going to die if I didn't do something that most people in my position had never done. She looked at Carter directly. I did it. The distance was 3,200 meters. The conditions were not ideal. I had one shot. I took it. The office was very quiet. Carter could hear his own breathing. How long have you been shooting? He asked. Since I was 8 years old, sir. And the level you're at now, the capability your badge represents, is that something you trained to reach or something you discovered? Emily considered the question with a seriousness that surprised him. She didn't answer immediately. She thought about it in the same way that exceptional people think about hard questions, not performing the thinking, but actually doing it. Both, she said finally. I trained because I had the talent. And I discovered the talent because I trained. They're not separate things. One fed the other. For 15 years, one fed the other. She paused. And there was one day when everything came together in a way that I couldn't have predicted it and can't fully explain. That's the day the badge represents. Carter nodded slowly. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside his window, the Colorado mountains were darkening as the sun dropped behind them. The base was settling into its evening rhythms. Tomorrow morning, he said, I'm going to ask you to demonstrate your capability at our longest range. I want Captain Reed and my senior officers present. I want to see what you can do. Emily held his gaze. What distance, sir? The distance on your badge, Carter said. Something moved across her face. It was too quick and too contained for him to fully read. But it wasn't fear. He was certain of that. Whatever it wasn't fear. Understood, sir. You'll have access to whatever equipment you need. I'll use the Barrett, she said, the one from Facility B. Once Kowalski finishes the recalibration. Carter raised an eyebrow. The rifle you were standing next to this morning. Yes, sir. Why that specific rifle? Emily looked at him with that steady, uncomplicated gaze. Because I know its characteristics. I spent 40 minutes with it this morning. I know how it breathes. Carter stared at her for another moment. Then, very carefully, he stood up and nodded. Dismissed, Sergeant. She stood, gave him a crisp nod, and walked out of the office with the same unhurried precision with which she had walked in. Carter stood at his window and watched the mountains go dark. He was a man who had spent 33 years evaluating people. Officers, enlisted soldiers, allies, adversaries. It was the core skill of command, the ability to look at a person and understand what they were capable of and what they weren't. Carter was very good at it. He had always been very good at it. But something had happened today that he had not experienced in a very long time. He had looked at Emily Hayes, and he had been wrong. Not just a little wrong. Not the kind of wrong that could be explained away by incomplete information or unusual circumstances. Fundamentally wrong. He had looked at her rank, her age, her appearance, and he had constructed a story about who she was. And the story he had constructed was so far from the truth that it almost didn't share any features with reality. The rifle with the invisible flaw that she had spotted from footage. The badge with the impossible number. The 19-year-old who had taken a shot at 3,200 meters to save American lives. Carter pressed his hand against the cold window glass and looked at his own reflection. He had been in command long enough to know that leadership was not about being right. It was about being honest when you were wrong. Tomorrow would be honest. He owed her that much. In the barracks that evening, Emily Hayes sat on the edge of her bunk with her hands in her lap. Her roommate, a Signal Corps sergeant named Tanya Okafor, had asked 3 careful questions about the day's events. She had clearly heard something, the way word always traveled on any base regardless of classification levels, and Emily had answered each one with a brevity that Okafor, who was perceptive, recognized as something other than coldness. Are you nervous? Okafor asked finally, sitting across from her in the narrow space between their 2 bunks. Emily thought about the question. No, she said. About tomorrow? No, Okafor studied her. I would be, I know. Half the base is going to be watching. I know. Okafor leaned forward a little. Emily, that distance. I've done it before, in combat conditions. Not on a demonstration range in front of a 4-star general who's already decided you're lying. Emily looked at her for a moment. He hasn't decided I'm lying. No, he's decided he doesn't understand. That's different. Emily's voice was quiet, but there was something in it, something layered and experienced. The voice of someone who had spent years thinking carefully about the difference between hostility and ignorance. When someone doesn't understand something, they fill the gap with what they know. Carter knows rank. He knows protocol. He knows that people on temporary assignment don't walk into restricted facilities. So he filled the gap with what he knew, and tomorrow he'll fill it with something else, Okafor said. Tomorrow he'll fill it with what he sees, Emily said. That's all I need. Okafor was quiet for a moment. What if the conditions are bad, she asked. Wind, pressure, temperature up here in the mountains, in the morning. I'll account for them, all of them, simultaneously. Emily looked at her, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a moment, something shifted in her expression. Something that Okafor would think about later, after everything had happened, as she tried to find words for it. It wasn't arrogance. It was further past arrogance than arrogance. It was the expression of someone looking at a problem they had solved so many times, in so many conditions, under so much pressure, that the solving of it had become something closer to memory than effort. Yes, Emily said simply. All of them, simultaneously. Okafor sat back. She looked at Emily Hayes, really looked at her for what felt like the first time. The small badge on her uniform caught the light. Who are you? Okafor asked softly, not unkindly, almost with wonder. Emily looked down at her hand. A quiet smile crossed her face, the only smile Okafor had seen from her all day. Just a soldier, she said, trying to do the job right. Okafor didn't push. She turned off the overhead light, and they both lay down in the dark, and the mountains outside the narrow window were enormous and silent, holding the base inside them, the way the mountains always had, indifferent and ancient and completely unmoved by what the people inside them thought they knew. Down the hallway in the officer's wing, Captain Michael Reed was still awake. He was sitting at his desk with a cup of cold coffee and a printed copy of the partial file on Emily Hayes, and he was reading the parts that weren't redacted for the fourth time. Not because he expected to find something new. He had read enough classified files to know that the information you could see was always a frame around the information you couldn't see. What he was doing, what he had been doing for the last hour, was trying to understand the shape of the frame. What was the redacted information shaped like? What kind of mission, at what kind of location, in what kind of conditions, produced a confirmed 3,200-meter hit from a 19-year-old staff sergeant who had been on active duty for less than a year? He had tried 4 different answers. None of them satisfied him. The 5th answer, the one he kept pushing away, the one that kept coming back, was the simplest one. She did it, exactly the way the badge says she did it. At 19 years old, in conditions we can't see, she took a shot that almost no one on Earth is capable of taking, and she made it. Reed had spent 8 years in Special Forces. He had worked with the best marksmen in the American military. He was absolutely certain that a 3,200-meter first-round hit was not something that happened by accident, by luck, or by circumstance. It was something that happened when a person had a very specific set of gifts, honed over a very specific period of time, brought to bear on a very specific moment. He had believed earlier today that the badge was wrong. He was less certain of that now. He put down the file and looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow morning, at Raven Peak's longest range, with the mountains as witness and half the base watching, a 23-year-old staff sergeant was going to stand behind a recalibrated Barrett M82A1 and attempt something that Michael Reed, with everything he knew and everything he'd seen, had never personally witnessed. He sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up the file one more time. He looked at the single unredacted line near the bottom of the page, beneath the classified mission references and the blocked-out deployment dates. It was a character assessment written by a commanding officer whose name was also redacted. It said, "This soldier does not perform under pressure. This soldier performs best under pressure. There is a difference, and it is the difference that matters most when lives depend on the outcome." Reed read it 3 times. Then he folded the file, set it aside, and sat in the quiet of his office while outside the Colorado mountains held the cold and the dark and the waiting. He had set the range himself per Carter's orders. He had placed the target. He had measured the distance. 3,200 meters. He had stood beside the target and looked back toward the shooting position and seen nothing. A faint shimmer of elevation, a distant ridge. The space between was a valley full of mountain air and changing winds, and all the 1,000 variables that turned extreme range marksmanship from a skill into something closer to a conversation with physics. Tomorrow he was going to watch Emily Hayes have that conversation. And for the first time since he had read her file, Michael Reed was no longer certain. He knew how it would end. The base woke up earlier than usual that morning, not because anyone had ordered it to. Not because there was a formation scheduled or an alert called. It woke up early, the way bases always wake up early, when something is about to happen that nobody can officially acknowledge, but everybody already knows about. Word had traveled through the hallways in the mess hall and the motor pool. The way word always travels in military installations, not through announcements, but through the specific quality of silence that surrounds something people aren't supposed to be talking about. By 5:45 in the morning, the mess hall had twice its normal population for that hour. Soldiers who usually rolled in at 6:30 were already seated with their trays, talking in the careful, lowered voices of people who were pretending they weren't talking about the one thing they were all talking about. Staff Sergeant, the restricted weapons bay, the badge with the impossible number, and the demonstration that General Carter had ordered for that morning. Sergeant Tanya Okafor sat across from Emily at a corner table and watched her eat breakfast with the same unhurried, methodical focus that Emily seemed to bring to every physical task. No phone, no conversation, just eggs, black coffee, and the quiet interior of someone who was already somewhere else in her mind, not distracted, but focused in the direction of something specific that only she could see. People are staring, Okafor said. I know, Emily said. Does it bother you? No. Okafor looked around the mess hall. Heads turned away when she caught eyes. Half of them think you're going to fail spectacularly. The other half think you're going to do something they've never seen before. She paused. I'm not sure which group is more nervous. Emily picked up her coffee. What group are you in? Okafor thought about it honestly. I'm in the group that watched you fall asleep last night like you had absolutely nothing on your mind. And I can't decide if that's the most confident things I've ever seen or the most terrifying. Emily, maybe both. Emily, Okafor leaned forward slightly. They moved the target. Last night, after you went to sleep. Captain Reed personally went out to the range and changed the placement. Emily looked up. I don't know the exact number, but the rumor from the range maintenance team is that it's not shorter. Emily was quiet for a moment. She set down her coffee cup. Of course it isn't, she said. And the way she said it, not bitter, not resigned, just matter of fact, as if she had expected nothing else, made Okafor sit back and look at her with something that had moved past admiration into something closer to awe. Are you angry? Okafor asked. At Reed. For moving it. Emily thought about the question with that same serious, unhurried consideration she brought to everything. Reed moved the target because he doesn't believe the badge, she said finally. He's not trying to sabotage me. He's trying to find the truth. He just has a different idea of what the truth looks like than what it actually is. She picked up her coffee again. That's not something to be angry at. That's something to correct. At that exact moment, across the base, Captain Michael Reed was standing in Carter's office with a map of the range layout spread on the desk between them. He had moved the target the night before, without informing the general not to deceive, but because he had been certain Carter would approve, and he had wanted to act before the wind conditions changed overnight. He was less certain of Carter's approval now that Carter was looking at him with that specific expression. You moved it without clearing it with me, Carter said. Yes, sir, I did. Why? Reed chose his words precisely. Because I wanted the test to be real, sir. If Hayes can do what her record suggests she can do, a controlled demonstration at the exact distance she's done before tells us very little. The environment changes. Conditions change. Capability that's real holds up under variation. Capability that's performed, he paused, doesn't. Carter looked at him for a long moment. How far did you move it? The new distance is 3,240 meters, sir. The office was quiet. Carter looked at the map. 40 meters further. Yes, sir. And the conditions this morning? Wind is variable out of the northwest. Temperature differential between the firing position and the target area is approximately 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The valley creates a turbulence pattern that I've modeled from the last 3 months of range weather data. Reed stopped. In my professional assessment, the conditions this morning are more challenging than average. In your professional assessment, Carter repeated slowly. Yes, sir. Carter was quiet for another moment. Then he folded the map and handed it back to Reed without another word. Reed took it, started for the door. Reed, he stopped. If she makes this shot, Carter said, without turning around, I want you to be standing close enough to hear the impact. Reed stood at the door for a beat. Yes, sir, he said. And he left. The range at Raven Peak was the longest operational shooting facility at any military installation in the continental United States. It ran the full length of a mountain valley, a channel of open terrain framed on both sides by terrain that acted as a natural wind funnel, beautiful for long-range training, brutal for extreme distance accuracy work, because the valley didn't just carry wind. Shaped it, redirected it, layered it in ways that changed second by second, depending on temperature and elevation, and a dozen other factors that couldn't be fully modeled by any system short of standing in the valley yourself and reading the air with everything you had. By 7:30, 32 people were assembled at the firing position. Senior officers, technical specialists, range safety personnel, and Captain Reed standing exactly where Carter had told him to stand close enough to hear what happened downrange. Carter arrived at 7:38. He walked to the center of the assembled group without speaking, turned to face the range, and waited. Emily arrived at 7:40. She was carrying the Barrett M82A1 herself. Not because anyone had required her to carry it, the weapon had been transported to the range by the armory team. She had simply walked to where the rifle was staged, lifted it, and carried it to the firing position. Nobody said anything. She set the rifle down, went to one knee beside it, and spent the next 4 minutes doing something that nobody watching had expected. Absolutely nothing dramatic. No elaborate equipment checks, no lengthy preparation ritual. She ran her hands over the rifle with the same focused efficiency that Kowalski ran his hands over engines, not performing expertise, simply exercising it. She checked the recalibration. She checked the bolt. She checked the magazine seating with 2 fingers in a single practice movement. Then she stood up and looked at the range. The valley stretched ahead of her for a distance that made the far end essentially invisible to the naked eye. Somewhere out there, 3,240 meters away, a distance that most human beings would understand only in the abstract, the length of roughly 32 football fields laid end to end was a steel target plate that may as well have been on the other side of a mountain. Colonel Whitmore stepped forward. He had been quiet since the incident in the weapons bay, carrying the particular discomfort of someone who knows they are peripherally implicated in something without quite knowing how. He cleared his throat. Sergeant Hayes. For the record, you are aware that the target distance has been modified from the originally stated parameter? Emily didn't look at him. She was reading the valley. Yes, sir. And you're prepared to proceed? Yes, sir. Whitmore stepped back. Reed crossed his arms. He was watching Emily's face, not the range. He had spent 8 years learning to read operators to identify the specific quality of attention that distinguished someone who was genuinely prepared from someone who was performing preparation. He was looking for the seams, the micro-expressions that indicated anxiety being managed rather than absent, the small physical tells that appeared in people who were outside the edge of their actual capability. He found nothing, and that, in itself, was the most unsettling thing he had encountered in the last 24 hours. Because in his experience, the absence of visible anxiety in genuinely high-pressure situations was not the same as calm. It was not the same as control. It was something rarer. It was the signature of someone for whom the pressure of the moment was simply smaller than their experience of having survived worse. Emily Hayes was standing at the edge of a 3,000-meter valley with half the senior staff of Raven Peak watching her, and she was reading the air the way you read a book you've read before, not for plot, not for surprise, but for the specific sentences you know are going to matter. She looked up, watched something in the sky above the valley, something none of the observers could identify. Then she looked down at the grass at the edge of the firing line. Watched it for a count of 3. Wind is shifting, she said quietly. To no one in particular. To herself, really, but her voice was steady enough to carry. Counterclockwise rotation in the valley. It'll stabilize in about 4 minutes. Nobody spoke. She waited. The 4 minutes were the longest 4 minutes that many of the people standing there had experienced in recent memory. Carter stood without moving. Reed stood without moving. Whitmore found something interesting to look at on the ground. The technical specialists exchanged a single glance and then looked back at the range. And Emily waited. Not impatiently. Not with the performing stillness of someone pretending to be patient. Just waited, the way you wait for something you understand is coming on its own schedule. At 4 minutes and approximately 20 seconds, she moved. She went to the firing position with a single fluid movement, settled behind the rifle, adjusted her position by a fraction that nobody watching could have quantified, and went completely still. No one on the range was breathing loud enough to hear themselves. She looked through the scope, and then something happened that Reed noticed before anyone else did, because he was watching her face, not the rifle. The minute tension that had been in her jaw, a tension so slight he hadn't consciously registered it until it disappeared, released. Her expression changed in a way that was completely invisible from more than 2 feet away. She had found something. Through that scope, at 3,240 meters, she had found something. She began to make adjustments, elevation dial, windage dial. Small movements, each one deliberate and certain. The movements of someone following a calculation they had already completed rather than performing a calculation in real time. Then she was still again. Reed realized he had taken a step forward without meaning to. He stopped himself. Carter had not moved. He was standing with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the far end of the valley, and his face telling exactly as much as he had decided it should tell, which was nothing at all. But his right thumb was pressing against the inside of his left fist in a way that Reed recognized as a sign of something. Then Emily exhaled, slowly, until her lungs were empty. And in the moment between the end of the exhale and the beginning of the next breath, in that fraction of biological stillness that experienced shooters know, is the body's most stable instant, she pulled the trigger. The Barrett M82A1 fired. The sound was enormous and then immediate gone, swallowed by the valley and the morning air, and what replaced it was something that nobody at Raven Peak had experienced in this specific combination before. Silence, true silence, not the silence of nothing happening. The silence of 32 people holding a collective breath, while time expanded into the seconds it took for a .5 caliber round to travel 3,240 meters through mountain air with variable northwest crosswind and a 9-degree temperature differential between the firing position and the target zone. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Carter's thumb pressed harder against his fist. Reed leaned forward. 4 seconds, 5, and then sound, distant, clean, unmistakable, steel hitting steel. The confirmation tone from the electronic target system triggered half a second later, a flat digital acknowledgement that the target had been struck. 1 round, first shot, 3,240 meters. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds after the sound. Then the range technical specialist looked at his display, looked at it again, and said in a voice that was trying and failing to be professionally neutral, confirmed hit, center mass, 3,240 meters, single round. The silence broke differently for different people. Whitmore made a sound that wasn't quite a word. 2 of the junior officers looked at each other with the specific expression of people witnessing something they know they'll be describing for the rest of their lives. One of the technical specialists sat down on the equipment case behind him and put his hands on his knees. Reed uncrossed his arms. He looked at the target display confirmation. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Emily Hayes. She had come out of the firing position and was standing upright beside the rifle. Her expression was contained and still. She was not smiling. She was not looking around at the observers to gauge their reactions. She was looking downrange, at the valley, at the distance she had just reached across. And Reed, who had spent 8 years in special forces and had worked with some of the most exceptional human beings the American military had ever produced, understood in that moment what the character assessment in her file had actually meant. This soldier does not perform under pressure. This soldier performs best under pressure. He had read those words and understood them intellectually. He understood them differently now. He understood them in his chest, in the specific physical location where things become real rather than theoretical. Carter spoke Sergeant Hayes. She turned and looked at him. Carter walked toward her. Not the approach he had made in the weapons bay the morning before, not the approach of a man who had already decided what he was walking toward. Something different. Something that, in a man of Carter's experience and rank and controlled affect, was remarkable to watch. He stopped in front of her. That was he stopped. Reconsidered. Started again. I want you to know that I have been in this military for 33 years. I have watched exceptional soldiers do exceptional things at exceptional moments. He paused. What you just did is not something I have a complete framework for, and I want to be honest with you about that. Emily looked at him. Thank you, sir. I also want to be honest with you. Carter continued, and his voice was lower now, and stripped of the command register, speaking directly, one person to another, about the fact that yesterday morning, I walked into that weapons bay and I made a judgment about you before I had any information that warranted that judgment. I made it based on what I could see. And what I could see, he stopped again, was wrong. Emily was quiet. I'm not apologizing for enforcing protocol, Carter said. The protocol exists for a reason. You violated it. That's a separate matter that we'll address through proper channels. He held her gaze. But I am acknowledging that the judgment I made about your capability, about your right to be in that room, about the badge on your uniform, about what you are and what you aren't, That judgment was supported by the fact, and I was wrong to make it the way I made it. Emily Hayes looked at General William Carter for a long moment. In the background, 30 people were very carefully looking at various parts of the landscape that were not this conversation. "General," she said finally, and her voice was steady and precise. "You responded to the information you had. Protocol violation, unauthorized access. Junior soldier in restricted space." She paused. "Those were accurate facts. The judgment they led to wasn't accurate. But I understand the path between them." She paused again. "What I would ask, sir, not for myself, but in general, is that next time the path between the facts and the judgment feels that clear, that obvious, you consider whether there might be information you don't yet have." Carter looked at her for a moment. Then something happened on his face that the people close enough to see it would later describe in different ways. Some would say he nodded. Some would say his expression changed. Reed, standing closer than most, would later say it was simpler than either of those things. The man looked at Emily Hayes the way you look at something that has cost you a comfortable assumption, and he let the assumption go. "Noted, Sergeant," Carter said quietly. "Noted." Reed stepped forward. He had been preparing what he was going to say for the last 90 seconds, and he delivered it now with the directness that was his particular version of respect. "Sergeant Hayes, I want to say directly that I moved that target last night. I changed the distance from what you were told it would be. I did it because I believed the badge was incorrect, and I wanted conditions that would expose the exaggeration if it existed." He stopped, breathed once. "There was no exaggeration. And I want you to know that I understand what that means, not just about your capability, but about my own assumptions. I was wrong, and I was wrong specifically because I thought I knew more than the evidence actually supported." Emily looked at Reed. Her expression was unreadable for a moment. Then very briefly something in it softened. "You were trying to find the truth," she said. "I was trying to disprove something I didn't want to believe was possible," Reed said. Emily held his gaze. "No," she agreed quietly. "But it's where some people end up when the truth is outside what they've personally witnessed." She paused. "You moved the target 40 meters further than the original distance. I still hit it. Now you've personally witnessed it." She looked at him steadily. "That's all that needed to happen." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand. Emily looked at it. Then she shook it. Once, firmly, the handshake of two people who have understood each other completely. They brought the target plate back from the range. It took 2 members of the maintenance team and a vehicle because the plate was heavy-grade steel and the distance was what the distance was. When they carried it back to the firing line and set it down, a group of 7 soldiers crowded around it immediately. The impact point was dead center. Not edge close, not zone close. Dead center, with the specific geometry of a round that had arrived exactly where it was aimed, having traveled through more than 3 kilometers of variable mountain air to find the exact place it had been sent. Kowalski, the master armorer, crouched beside the plate and looked at the impact without speaking. Then he looked up at Emily, who was standing at the edge of the group. "The recalibration I did this morning," he said. "The 0.003-degree correction. That mattered at this distance." "Yes," Emily said. "If you hadn't found the deviation from the footage, someone else would have found it eventually." Kowalski shook his head slowly. "No, Sergeant. I've been working with weapons systems for 22 years. I found it with specialized equipment. You found it from video during a briefing." He looked at the impact point on the plate again. "If you had come to this range this morning with the unrecalibrated rifle." "I wouldn't have," Emily said simply. "That's why I went into the weapons bay." The quiet that followed that sentence had a specific quality. It was the quiet of a group of people simultaneously reconstructing a timeline and arriving at the same conclusion at the same moment. The scope was wrong. Emily found it. Emily entered the restricted bay without authorization to confirm what she'd found and verify the error. Carter ordered her out. Carter ordered a demonstration that was now going to use the corrected rifle, the rifle that had been corrected, because Emily violated protocol to make sure the correction happened. Whitmore said it out loud first, slowly, like a man doing long division in his head. "If you hadn't gone into the weapons bay, the demonstration would have been on a rifle with a faulty scope," Emily said. "At 3,000 meters plus with a 0.003-degree reticle deviation, the round would have landed outside the target zone." She paused. "The demonstration would have failed. Not because of capability, because of equipment." The silence stretched. Carter was standing at the edge of the group. He had arrived back there sometime in the last few minutes, without anyone noticing. His face was completely still. "You knew that," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, sir." "When you went into the weapons bay yesterday morning?" "Yes, sir. I knew the demonstration would be ordered. I knew what rifle would be used, and I knew the rifle needed to be corrected before the demonstration could be accurate. She looked at Carter directly. The protocol violation was deliberate, sir, but the reason for it was to ensure the demonstration reflected actual capability rather than equipment failure. The silence went a different direction now, longer, denser. Carter looked at her for a very long time. You violated protocol, he said slowly, to protect the integrity of a demonstration that you didn't yet know was going to be ordered. I knew it would be ordered, sir, within 24 hours, given the circumstances. And how did you know that? Emily paused, and for the first time since the beginning of this entire sequence of events, something that might have been the faintest trace of dry humor crossed her face. Because you're a general who just found a junior soldier touching a restricted rifle and claiming she authorized herself. Sir, a demonstration was the inevitable response. Reed made a sound that was almost a laugh, quickly converted into a cough. Kowalski looked at the ground. Carter looked at Emily Hayes for the longest he had looked at her yet. Then he did something nobody watching had seen General William Carter do in the entire time any of them had known him. He shook his head, not in negation, not in displeasure. In something that looked, on his face, remarkably like the specific expression of a man who has realized that he has been outthought, outmaneuvered, and completely outprepared by a 23-year-old staff sergeant on temporary assignment, and who is honest enough with himself and old enough, and experienced enough to find that more impressive than infuriating. Stand down for this morning, Sergeant Hayes, he said. Report to my office at 1300. Yes, sir. And Sergeant looked at him. Good shooting. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, sir. She picked up the Barrett M82A1, handed it to Kowalski with a nod, and walked off the range with the same unhurried, uncomplicated stride she'd carried into every room for the last 24 hours. The group at the firing line watched her go. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then one of the junior officers, a lieutenant named Vasquez, who had been standing at the back of the group, trying to make himself as professionally invisible as possible, said, very quietly, to the lieutenant standing next to him, did she just explain to the general that she committed a protocol violation specifically to make sure that if the general ordered a demonstration in response to the protocol violation, the demonstration would be accurate? The other lieutenant stared after Emily's retreating figure. Yes, he said. I think she did, and she knew he would order the demonstration before he ordered it. Apparently. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. How far ahead was she thinking when she walked into that weapons bay? The other lieutenant, whose name was Park, thought about it for a second. Further than us, he said finally. Back at the firing line, Reed stood alone with the target plate at his feet, looking at the impact point. The morning had shifted around him. The quality of the light had changed. The way light changes after something significant has happened in a space, though that was not literally true, and he knew it. What had changed was him. He had come to this range as a skeptic. He had moved the target in the dark to make the test harder. He had stood at the firing line and watched and waited with the specific intention of seeing the moment when the performance fell apart, when the gap between the claim and the reality revealed itself. The gap had not revealed itself. What had revealed itself instead was the gap between what he had believed and what was true. And that gap, the distance between his certainty and the actual facts, was, in its own way, more precise and more measurable than the 3,240 meters that Emily Hayes had just crossed with a single round. He thought about the character assessment in her file, about the redacted mission sections, about a 19-year-old in conditions he couldn't see, with one shot and people's lives in the balance. He thought about a 23-year-old who walked into a restricted weapons bay, knowing exactly what she was doing, and exactly what it would cost her, and exactly what would happen next, and did it anyway because the alternative was a demonstration that failed for the wrong reasons. He thought about what it meant to be that far ahead of a situation, to see not just the problem in front of you, but the chain of problems behind it, and to move through them not one at a time, but all at once, the way a chess player doesn't just see the next move, but the next 15. Reed picked up the target plate. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it to the transport vehicle himself, declined the help that one of the maintenance crew offered, and put it in the back with the particular care you give to something that has earned it. Then he stood beside the vehicle in the thin Colorado mountain air and looked at the valley. 3,240 meters. From here to the small mark on that faraway ridge that you couldn't see with the naked eye and couldn't quite believe in, even when the measurement was right in front of you. He stood there for a while, long enough that the maintenance crew exchanged a glance and decided not to interrupt him. He was not looking at the distance. He was looking at what he had learned about the distance between what you know and what you think you know, about the gap between expertise and assumption, about the specific, costly mistake of being so certain about what was impossible that you stopped truly looking at what was right in front of you. He was looking at that and thinking about it and letting it do what real lessons do when they're real. It settled into him, not lightly, not easily, but permanently. The 1,300-hour meeting started 4 minutes late, not because Carter was unprepared. Carter was never unprepared. It started late because at 12:56, his secure line rang with a call from a number that his aide Ortega recognized immediately and flagged with a single knock on the office door and a look that said everything without saying anything. Carter picked up on the second ring. The conversation lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Ortega stood outside the closed door and heard nothing but the particular quality of silence that comes through a wall when someone on the other side of it is listening more than speaking. When Carter opened the door, his face had changed in a way that Ortega couldn't fully describe later when Reed asked him about it. Not darker, not lighter, more complicated, like a map that had gained new roads. "Push Hayes to 1315, Carter said quietly. "Yes, sir, and get me the full classification index on Operation Clearwater." Ortega went very still for exactly 1 second. "Sir, that's a 4-level clearance file." "I know what it is, Lieutenant. Get it." Ortega got it. Carter spent the 14 minutes before Emily's arrival reading. He read standing up, which was something Ortega had seen him do exactly twice before in 3 years of service together, both times when the information was the kind that needed the full body awake and engaged, not just the mind. When Emily knocked at 13:15 exactly, Carter was on the last page. He closed the file, set it face down on the desk, looked at the door. Enter. She came in the same way she always came in, anywhere, clean, precise, no wasted movement. She stood at attention in front of his desk. Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down, Sergeant." She sat. He looked at her for another moment without speaking. The kind of looking that Emily recognized not from Carter specifically, but from a category of persons she had encountered before. People who had just learned something that reorganized everything they thought they already understood. "How much of Operation Clearwater can you talk to me about?" Carter asked. The air in the room changed. Emily's expression didn't shift, not visibly, not in any way that a camera would have caught. But something in her posture adjusted by the kind of fraction that only someone trained to notice would register. Not fear, not guilt. The specific physical realignment of a person who has just arrived at a conversation they knew was coming and had been preparing for, at some level, for a long time. "Operationally, very little, sir," she said. "The mission parameters, the location, the personnel involved, those are still active classification. I can't discuss specifics." "I'm not asking for specifics," Carter said carefully. "I'm asking about the shot." Emily was quiet. "Your record shows a confirmed engagement at 3,200 meters during Operation Clearwater. You were 19 years old. You had been on active duty for 11 months. Carter paused. "The file around that engagement is blacked out in a way that tells me the circumstances were unusual, even by classified standards." He held her gaze. "I want to understand what happened to a 19-year-old soldier that produced the badge you're wearing. Not the tactical details, the human reality." Emily looked at him steadily. "Why, sir?" Carter didn't answer immediately. That was notable. Carter was a man who always had an immediate answer. He had been trained since his 20s to produce immediate answers because the world he operated in ran on immediate answers, and people who hesitated paid for it. He was hesitating now. "Because this morning," he said finally, "I watched you do something that I have never seen anyone do in 33 years of military service. And 3 years of reading people in this building tells me that the thing I watched this morning is connected to something that happened to you a long time ago. Something that shaped you in a way that a normal training program doesn't explain." He paused. "I want to understand that, not for operational purposes. For the right reasons." Emily looked at him for a long time. Outside, the Colorado wind moved against the building. They could both hear it, the specific sound of high-altitude air pressing against reinforced walls, finding the edges, looking for a way in. "I had a commanding officer when I was 18, Emily said finally. Her voice was steady, but it was a different kind of steady than the steady she'd carried through the weapons bay and the ranged demonstration. That steadiness had been clean and uncomplicated. This was the steadiness of effort. "Sergeant First Class Aaron Tate. He recruited me out of basic. He'd heard about my shooting scores, and he wanted to evaluate me personally before deciding whether to recommend me for the specialized program." Carter listened without moving. "He put me through 4 months of evaluation. It was harder than anything I'd done before. Not physically, I could keep up, but mentally. He didn't just test what I could do. He tested how I thought, why I made the decisions I made, whether I could hold a calculation in my head under conditions that were designed to make the calculation impossible. She paused. He told me something at the end of the evaluation period that I've thought about almost every day since. What did he tell you? Emily's hands resting in her lap were still. He said, at the distance you're capable of shooting, by the time the bullet arrives, you have already lived the entire future of that shot. Every variable you calculated, every adjustment you made, every assumption you carried into the decision, all of it is already permanent. The bullet just catches up. She paused. He said, that means the shot doesn't happen when you pull the trigger. It happens the moment you start thinking about it. Everything after that is physics. Carter was quiet. Operation Clearwater happened 8 months after that conversation, Emily said. I was part of a support team. I was not supposed to be in a primary engagement role. The circumstances changed very rapidly in a direction that nobody had planned for. She stopped. I can't tell you what the mission was or where. What I can tell you is that there were 6 American soldiers in a position that was going to become unrecoverable within a very short time window. And the only way to change the position required a shot that the senior operators on my team assessed as outside achievable parameters. Outside achievable parameters, Carter repeated quietly. Yes, sir, the distance, the conditions, the time available for preparation, the wind, the angle. The team lead looked at the situation and made the professional judgment that the shot was not makeable. Emily paused. And he was right. For him at his level, with his experience, he was right. It wasn't makeable. But you believed it was makeable for you. I didn't believe anything, sir. I calculated it. There's a difference. She looked at Carter directly. Belief is what you carry when you don't have enough information to be certain. Calculation is what you do when you have enough information and the right tools and the experience to process both accurately. She paused. I had all 3. The shot was makeable, not by most people. By me at that moment with what I had. I knew that the way you know the answer to a math problem, not hope certainty. And the team lead didn't agree. At first, Emily was quiet for a moment. He was experienced enough to know that there's a category of capability that exists outside normal operational ranges. And he was honest enough when I laid out the calculation, every variable, every adjustment, the complete trajectory analysis. He was honest enough to look at it and say he couldn't disprove it. So he let you take the shot. He made a command decision to give me the opportunity, sir. That's different from letting me. He evaluated the alternatives. He evaluated the risk. He made the call. It was the hardest call I've ever watched someone make. Because if I was wrong, if the calculation had a flaw, if I'd misjudged any variable, if the conditions shifted in the final second, the outcome wasn't just a missed shot. The outcome was 6 soldiers, and whatever information those 6 soldiers were carrying, and everything that depended on them. The office was completely quiet. Carter realized he had been holding the same position for the last several minutes without noticing it. He shifted slightly, settled, kept his eyes on her face. But you weren't wrong, he said. No, sir, first round. Yes, sir, at 19. Emily looked at him. Age doesn't change the physics, sir. Carter sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not because anything was up there, but because some thoughts need a different angle of approach. The 6 soldiers, he said. They made it out.
Yes, sir.
Because of that shot. Because of that shot, and 11 other decisions made by 11 other people before and after it, sir. I'm one variable in an equation that had a lot of variables. Carter brought his eyes back to her face. You're the variable that changed the outcome. Emily didn't argue. But she didn't accept it with the particular self-satisfaction that Carter had seen in some exceptional soldiers, the ones who let their capability become identity, who stopped being people and started being performances of themselves. She accepted it the way you accept a factual statement. Neutral, accurate, filed, in its correct place. Sergeant Tate, Carter said. Where is he now? Something moved across Emily's face. Quick, contained, but real. He was killed in action 14 months after Clearwater, sir. The quiet that followed was different from the previous quiets in the room. It had weight, Carter said. Emily nodded once. He was the best officer I ever served under. Carter let that sit for a moment. Then is that why you're here? On temporary assignment at Raven Peak? Emily looked at him. A fraction of hesitation. Not deception. Carter had been reading people too long to miss the difference. More like a person deciding how much of a true answer to give. Partly, sir, she said finally. And the other part? Before she could answer, the secure line rang again. Carter looked at it, looked at Emily. Give me a moment, Sergeant. He picked up the line, listened for 40 seconds. His face told Reed nothing, and would have told anyone else nothing. But Ortega, who had served with him for 3 years and could read the space between his sentences the way a musician reads rests in a score, would have said later that what he heard in those 40 seconds changed something in the general's approach to the remainder of the afternoon. Carter said 2 words, understood and confirmed, and put the phone down. He looked at Emily Hayes. There's someone who wants to speak with you, he said. Emily's expression didn't change, but her stillness got a different quality to it. Who, sir? Carter looked at her for a moment. The people who put the redactions in your file. At 1400 hours, Emily Hayes was escorted to a secure conference room on the 2nd floor of the main building that most of Raven Peak's permanent staff didn't know existed. Not because it was secret, it was on the facility blueprints, but because it was the kind of room that didn't draw attention to itself, the kind of room that looked, from the outside, like a communications relay station, and functioned, on the inside, as the most acoustically isolated space on the base. Carter came with her. He hadn't been asked to. He had told Ortega he was going to the conference room and left before Ortega could formulate a response. 2 people were in the room when they arrived. A man and a woman, both in civilian clothes, both carrying the specific quality of stillness that Emily recognized from exactly one other category of person she had encountered in her life, people who operated in spaces that had no public names. The woman was approximately 50, with gray at her temples and the kind of face that had learned to give away nothing from long practice at exactly that. The man was younger, maybe 35, and he was looking at Emily with an expression that was harder to read than the woman's, not because it was more controlled, but because it seemed to contain something genuine beneath the professional surface. The woman spoke first. Sergeant Hayes, thank you for meeting with us. Emily nodded. Didn't speak. My name is Director Callahan. This is my associate, Agent Marsh. We're part of the oversight body that manages the classification level of your service record. She paused. We've been following the events of the last 24 hours here at Raven Peak. Carter, standing to Emily's left, said nothing. There's information in your record, Callahan continued, that relates directly to the events of this morning and to why you were assigned to this base. We'd like to discuss that now. She looked at Carter. General, I understand you have your own clearance for what I'm about to share. Everything I say in this room is covered under that clearance. Carter nodded once. Callahan looked back at Emily. Sergeant Hayes, why do you think you were assigned to Raven Peak on temporary orders? Emily was quiet for a moment. I was told it was a routine temporary assignment, ma'am. Cross-training and evaluation, that's the documentation. What do you think the actual reason was? Emily looked at her steadily. I think someone wanted to see how I operated in an environment where my reputation didn't precede me, where people didn't know my record, where I had to function on my own capability without the context that would normally accompany it. Callahan looked at her for a long time. Why would someone want that? Because you can't fake capability in a vacuum, Emily said. You can perform it when people know what to expect. You can't perform it when nobody knows anything. Marsh, the younger agent, spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter than Callahan's. And how did you know you were being evaluated? Emily turned her attention to him. I didn't know. I suspected. What tipped you? The temporary orders were too generic. The assignment parameters were too undefined. In my experience, genuinely routine temporary assignments have specific tasks attached to them. Mine had none. She paused. And the timing. My orders came through 48 hours after a specific internal review of long-range capability across the branch. I made that connection. Marsh and Callahan exchanged a look that was brief and contained exactly as much information as they wanted it to contain, which was almost nothing. But Emily registered it. Carter registered it too. What is she being evaluated for? Carter asked. Callahan looked at him. A program that doesn't have a public name yet, General. What I can tell you is that it involves capabilities at the extreme edge of what current operational parameters define as achievable. We've been looking for specific individuals not based on rank or record or reputation, but based on how they operate when none of those things are visible. She looked back at Emily. The weapons bay incident was not planned, but it was informative. In what way? Carter asked. Callahan looked at Emily instead of Carter. Sergeant Hayes, would you like to answer that? Emily looked at Callahan. You watched how I responded to an authority challenge in an environment where I had no protective context, no reputation to rely on, no relationships to buffer the consequences. Just the decision I'd made and the reasons I'd made it, presented to a commanding officer who had no reason to believe me. She paused. You wanted to see whether I'd perform the decision or own it. And which did you do? Marsh asked quietly. Owned it, Emily said. I told the general I authorized myself because I did. That's accurate. I didn't try to reframe it as something more palatable. I didn't manage the impression. I stated the fact and accepted the consequence. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Callahan did something that nobody in the room had expected from her. She looked at Carter. "General Carter," she said, "we'd like your assessment of Sergeant Hayes based on the last 24 hours. Carter looked mildly surprised for approximately 1 second. Then he recalibrated and answered the way he answered every direct question directly. "She's the most capable soldier I've personally encountered in 33 years of service," he said. "Not in terms of the shooting. The shooting is extraordinary, but it's one data point. What I've witnessed in the last 24 hours is a level of integrated thinking, tactical, operational, and interpersonal simultaneously that I didn't believe existed at this level in a soldier of her age and rank." He paused. "She walked into my weapons bay and violated protocol for a reason that was so far ahead of the immediate situation that I didn't understand the reason until after the demonstration. She calculated not just the shot, but the entire sequence of events surrounding the shot, including my response to the protocol violation, and she optimized for the correct outcome at every step." He looked at Emily briefly and then back at Callahan. "In my professional assessment, she is operating at a level that temporary assignment and current rank do not begin to reflect." Callahan nodded. "Sergeant Hayes," she said, "are you prepared to hear what we're offering?" Emily looked at her. A breath. "Yes, ma'am." What Callahan described over the next 7 minutes deliberately, with careful language and precise omissions, was not a program that existed in any document that Raven Peak's permanent staff would ever access. It was a designation, a specific operational category for individuals whose capability existed at ranges, literally and operationally, that standard military structure wasn't designed to accommodate. Not special forces, not intelligence. Something further along the spectrum than either, in a direction that the military had been developing quietly since 3 years before Emily was born. The kind of work that required exactly the profile that Emily had demonstrated, someone whose capabilities were extraordinary, whose judgment was integrated rather than sequential, who could operate without protective context, and who could be honest about difficult decisions in rooms full of authority without performing or deflecting. Carter listened to all of it without asking a question, which was not normal for Carter. He was filing, not evaluating. The evaluation would come later, in private, after his emotions about the last 24 hours had been properly sorted into their correct compartments. His emotions were, he recognized, somewhat complicated. He was proud of Emily Hayes, which was a strange thing to feel about a soldier he had met less than 48 hours ago and had spent the first 12 hours of that acquaintance misreading. He was also, and he was honest enough with himself to name it, accurately humbled by her. Not in a damaging way. In the way that good humility works, a recalibration, a correction, a return to accuracy. He had been wrong about her. He had been wrong in a specific, professional, consequential way. And the depth of his wrongness was a function of the depth of his certainty. He had been certain, and certainty without sufficient information was not expertise. It was habit wearing the clothes of expertise. He was going to think about that for a long time. When Callahan finished, she looked at Emily and waited. Emily was quiet for a count of 3. She was not performing consideration. She was doing it. "I have one question," she said. "Go ahead." "Sergeant First Class Aaron Tate. He recommended me for Operation Clearwater. His recommendation is in the redacted sections of my file." She looked at Callahan directly. "He recommended me for whatever you're describing now. Before he died, didn't he?" The silence that followed that question had a texture to it. Marsh looked at the table. Callahan held Emily's gaze. "Yes," Callahan said quietly. "He did." Emily absorbed that. She didn't look away. She didn't blink more than normal. She absorbed it the way a person absorbs information that confirms something they believed but hadn't wanted to confirm, with a stillness that is very different from acceptance, but will eventually become it. "When did he file the recommendation?" Emily asked. 13 days before his death," Callahan said. 3 seconds of silence. "He knew he was going into something high risk," Emily said. "It wasn't a question. He was always going into something high risk," Callahan said carefully. "That was the nature of his work. But this particular mission..." "Sergeant Hayes," Callahan's voice was gentle but firm. "Some questions I can answer, some I can't. What I can tell you is that Aaron Tate was one of the most exceptional officers we have ever worked with. And the last professional act he completed before his final mission was to write the most detailed and comprehensive individual assessment I have ever read in 22 years of reviewing personnel files." She paused. "Every observation in that assessment has been confirmed by what we witnessed in the last 24 hours. Emily looked at the table for a moment. Her hands were in her lap, and they were still. Not the stillness of control, the stillness of someone carrying weight and being very familiar with how to carry it. Then she looked up. "I'll take the designation," she said. Carter looked at her. "Sergeant, I've been thinking about this since I got the temporary orders," Sir Emily said quietly. She looked at him, not as a subordinate looks at a commanding officer, but as one person looks at another across the specific shared ground of honesty. "I told you I suspected why I was here. I suspected this specifically. I've had 4 days to think about whether I wanted it." She paused. "Tate wanted me to have this opportunity. That's not the only reason. But it's a real reason, and I don't walk away from real reasons." Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Later that afternoon at 1640, with the Colorado sun beginning its long, slow fall behind the western ridgeline, Captain Michael Reed was waiting in the hallway outside the conference room when Emily walked out alone. Callahan and Marsh had left through a different exit. Carter had gone back to his office. Emily saw Reed standing there and stopped. He looked at her for a moment. He had the file in his hand, the partial, redacted file he had read 4 times the night before. He held it up briefly, not as an accusation, just as an acknowledgement. "I moved the target 40 meters further last night because I thought the badge was inflated," he said. "I know. He stopped. "I put in a formal request this morning to have your scope of clearance reviewed before the demonstration. I wanted access to the parts of your file that are redacted." He paused. "I was building a case that the record was inaccurate." Emily looked at him, "And now?" Reed folded the file. "Now I'm standing here because I want to say something directly, and I want you to hear it directly." He met her eyes. "I was wrong. Not just about the shot, about the framework I used to evaluate you. I used my experience as the measure, and my experience was the limit, not the standard. That's a mistake I've made before, but not at this level, and not with these consequences." He paused. "I owe you an honest acknowledgement of that." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Reed was not a man who offered things like this easily. She understood that, and she understood what it cost him to stand in this hallway and say it without a witness and without an audience. "You found the truth this morning," she said. "That's what matters. I tried to prevent the truth from happening. You tried to verify it. Those are related but not identical." She looked at him steadily. "Captain, you move that target because you have high standards for what you accept as real. That's not a character flaw, it's a professional discipline. The question is always whether the standard is calibrated correctly, whether you're applying rigor or applying habit. This morning recalibrated it." Reed looked at her. "How are you this?" He stopped himself. "This what?" He considered the word carefully. "Precise," he said finally. "About other people. About the gap between what they do and why they do it." Emily considered the question genuinely. "Because Tate taught me that you can't calculate a shot without calculating the environment," she said. "The wind, the temperature, the pressure, all of it. People work the same way. You can't understand what someone does without understanding the conditions that shape the doing." She paused. "You didn't move that target because you wanted me to fail. You moved it because the standard matters to you. I can work with someone who has high standards. I can't work with someone who doesn't have any." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that was, for him, an extraordinary thing to say. "I'd like to learn from you," he said. "Not the shooting, the other thing. The way you read a situation." He paused. "If you're willing." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me something you actually want to know," she said. "That's where it starts." Reed thought for a second. Then he asked the question he'd actually been holding since the moment the bullet reached the target that morning. "When you were 19, he said, "in Clearwater, one shot, Slavs on the line, were you afraid?" Emily's expression shifted. The professional composure, which had been so steady for so long, allowed something through. "Not much." "Yes," she said quietly. "Missing?" "Of what it would mean if I didn't try." She held his gaze. "Missing I could survive. Choosing not to try because I was afraid that I couldn't." Reed stood in the hallway and let that answer find the place in him where things became permanent. He nodded once. Emily nodded back. She walked down the hallway in the direction of the barracks, carrying the weight of a day that had changed more than one person's understanding of what was possible, and what capable really meant, and how far a person could see when they had been taught by the right teacher at the right moment to look past the limit of what everyone else believed was the edge. Behind her, Reed stood alone in the hallway with a folded file in his hand and a recalibrated understanding of the distance between certainty and truth. And in his office, General William Carter sat at his desk with the face-down classified file in front of him and his hands flat on the desk and the mountain wind pressing against his window. And he thought about a 19-year-old soldier who had seen further than anyone around her and chosen to act on what she saw. And he thought about what it meant, what it really meant, to lead people who were capable of things you couldn't imagine. He thought about it for a long time. The next morning came in harder than the one before it. By 5:15, the wind had shifted from the northwest to something more complicated, a rotating pressure system that the base meteorologist flagged in his morning report as potentially disruptive to outdoor operations. Carter read the report at 5:23, filed it in the part of his mind that would matter if range operations were scheduled, and moved on to the thing that had actually kept him awake until 2 in the morning. The personnel file of Sergeant First Class Aaron Tate. Carter had requested it through proper classification channels at 1700 the day before. It had arrived, partially declassified, at 22:15. He had read it twice before midnight and once more at 1 in the morning, when he woke up and couldn't find his way back to sleep. Aaron Tate had enlisted at 19. He had spent the next 17 years in the kind of operational work that built careers that couldn't be fully described in any document that would ever be reviewed by anyone without a 4-level clearance. He had been decorated 4 times. He had trained operators across 3 separate specialized programs. He had written assessment reports on more than 60 individual soldiers over the course of his career, and every report that Carter could access in the declassified sections showed the same thing: a man who understood human capability, not as a category, but as a specific individual measurable thing that looked different in every person who carried it. The assessment he had written on Emily Hayes 13 days before his death was the longest single personnel document in the partially declassified file. 14 pages. Single-spaced. The kind of document that took days to write and that you only wrote when you believed the subject was going to matter. Carter sat with that at 2 in the morning and thought about what it meant to see that far into another person. To be so certain about what they carried that you spent your last operational weeks making sure someone else would find them after you were gone. Tate had known he wasn't coming back from the mission. Carter was now certain of that. Not because anything in the file said it directly. The mission parameters were still classified above his access level, but because of the timing. 13 days. The completeness of the assessment. The fact that it had been routed to Callahan's division rather than standard personnel records. He had known, and knowing, he had spent those 13 days writing 14 pages about Emily Hayes. Carter put the file down at 2:15 and lay in the dark and thought about the soldiers he had known, who saw things that clearly, who understood their own mortality, not as an abstract future event, but as an operational parameter, who filed it in the correct compartment and kept working. He had known 3 such soldiers in 33 years. Aaron Tate apparently had been a 4th, and Emily Hayes was carrying all of it. The capability, the loss, the weight of being the person someone had believed in so completely that their last professional act was a 14-page document making sure the world didn't miss her. At 6:45, Carter called Reed. Reed answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "My office, Carter, 7:15. "Yes, sir." Reed arrived at 7:13. Carter had coffee ready, which was notable enough that Reed registered it and adjusted his expectations for the conversation accordingly. Carter got directly to the point. "I read Tate's file last night," he said. Reed was quiet for a moment. "I requested it 3 weeks ago," he said carefully. "The request was denied, classification level. I know. I pulled it on emergency executive authority last night." Carter looked at him. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room without my authorization." "Understood, sir." Carter told him what he'd found. Not all of it. Some of it was still above Reed's clearance, but the shape of it. 14-page assessment. The timing. What it meant about what Tate had known going into his final mission. Reed listened without interrupting, which was not his default behavior. He listened with the specific quality of attention that Carter had seen from him. Before, the attention of someone storing information in real time, filing it, cross-referencing it against things he already knew. When Carter finished, Reed was quiet for a long moment. "She carries that every day," Reed said. Not a question. A statement that arrived with someone who had just understood something they had been looking at from the wrong angle. "Yes," Carter said. "And yesterday when Callahan told her about the 14 days. She already knew," Carter said. "Not the specific timeline. But she knew he'd recommended her before he died. She'd been carrying that too." He paused. "The question I keep coming back to is whether she understood yesterday in that conference room the full weight of what Tate invested in her." Reed looked at him. "Did she seem like someone who didn't understand it?" Carter thought about Emily's face in that conference room. The stillness that had a different quality to it. The way she had held Callahan's gaze when she asked about Tate's recommendation. The single breath she had taken before saying she'd accept the designation. No, Carter said quietly. She seemed like someone who has understood it for years and has been living up to it every day since. Reed looked at his coffee. That's a weight I'm not sure I could carry. You don't know what you can carry until you're given it, Carter said. Tate apparently knew what she could carry before she did. Reed was quiet for a moment. What does she not know? From the file. What is she still missing? Carter looked at him. There's a section in Tate's assessment, still classified above both our levels. Callahan would have access to it. Whatever is in that section, I believe it's information about the mission, about the specific circumstances of his death. He paused. Emily doesn't know those specifics. I'm not sure she ever will. Reed absorbed that. Does she need to know? Carter considered the question seriously. I don't know, he said finally. That's an honest answer. I don't know if it would help her, or hurt her, or change nothing. What I know is that whatever is in that section, Tate wanted Emily to have this opportunity regardless. He made the decision to advocate for her knowing what was in that section. He looked at Reed directly. That tells me the information doesn't change what he believed about her. They sat with that for a moment. At 800 hours, Carter had a scheduled meeting with Callahan before she and Marsh left the base. He walked into the conference room on the second floor and found Callahan already seated with a single folder in front of her and the expression of someone who had also not slept particularly well. Marsh was not present. Carter noted that without asking about it. General, Callahan said, director. Carter sat down across from her. He did not waste time. I read Tate's file last night. Callahan's expression shifted minimally. You had the clearance for the declassified section. I read what was available. I want to ask you about what wasn't. Callahan looked at him steadily. Some of that remains above your access level, General. I understand that. I'm not asking for specifics. Carter leaned forward slightly. I'm asking whether Emily Hayes knows the full circumstances of Aaron Tate's death. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences Carter had experienced in this building over the last 48 hours. This one was older. It had been sitting somewhere for a long time before it arrived in this room. No, Callahan said finally. She doesn't. Will she? Callahan looked at the folder in front of her. That's a question that doesn't have a clean answer, General. She paused. What I can tell you is that the information is compartmentalized for reasons that extend beyond Emily's personal circumstances. The mission that Tate was involved in, the full scope of it, involves active operational elements that cannot be disclosed without significant risk to ongoing activities. So the answer is no, not now. The answer is not now. Whether it becomes yes at some point is not something I can determine from this room today. Carter looked at her. She's taking the designation you offered. Yes, and she's going to be operating in the same general space that Tate operated in. Different parameters, but adjacent, yes. Then at some point, Carter said carefully, she may encounter information through operational channels that tells her more than you've told her directly. Callahan met his gaze. That is a possibility we've considered. And your plan in that scenario? Callahan was quiet for a moment. To have told her enough truth before that point, that the additional information arrives in a context that makes sense rather than one that doesn't. She paused. Which is part of why I'm telling you this now. Because you're going to see her this morning. And there are things you can honestly say to her that will matter more coming from you, having watched what happened yesterday, than they would coming from me. Carter looked at her. What things? Callahan slid the folder across the table. Carter opened it. It was not the classified section of Tate's file. It was a single page, a personal letter, handwritten on plain paper in the kind of precise and deliberate handwriting of someone who rarely wrote by hand and was taking extra care. It was addressed to Emily Hayes. And at the bottom, the signature was Aaron Tate's. Carter looked up at Callahan. She doesn't know this exists. No, this was with his personal effects, found with his operational kit after the mission. He had left instructions for it to be forwarded to our division rather than standard personal effects processing. Callahan's voice was measured and careful. He knew we would understand what to do with it and when. When is now, Carter said. We believe so, yes. Carter looked at the letter. He did not read it. It wasn't addressed to him. He folded it carefully, exactly along its original crease, and set it on top of the closed folder. I'll give it to her, he said. At 9:30, Carter asked Ortega to find Emily Hayes and send her to his office at 10:00. He sat at his desk in the 45 minutes between those two events and did something he rarely did in his office, in his building, on his base. He sat with uncertainty. Not operational uncertainty, he was comfortable with that, had been comfortable with it for decades. This was a different kind. The uncertainty of someone who had spent 33 years believing that rank and experience were reliable guides to truth, and who had encountered, in the last 48 hours, a very specific and very complete proof that they were not. He thought about what it meant to hand someone a letter from a man who had believed in them so much that he had written it, knowing he was going into something he might not come back from. He thought about what it meant for a 23-year-old to carry that. He thought about what Aaron Tate had seen in Emily Hayes at 18 years old that told him she could carry it. And then he stopped thinking about all of it and picked up his pen and wrote himself a single note, because Carter was a man who documented the important things, even when they were personal, especially when they were personal. The note said, "The depth of your certainty is not the measure of your accuracy. Question the former to protect the latter." He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in his uniform pocket. Emily arrived at 1000. She knocked once, precise as always. Entered when told. She looked rested, which surprised Carter and then didn't surprise him because he was already adjusting the framework through which he looked at her. Of course she looked rested. She had made her decision the day before. Uncertainty was exhausting. Clarity, even when the clarity was about something heavy, was restoring. She sat down. Carter looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the folded letter and placed it on the desk between them. Emily looked at it, then at him. "What is that, sir?" "It was found with Aaron Tate's personal effects after his final mission," Carter said. "It was held by the Program Oversight Division pending the appropriate moment to forward it." He paused. "Director Callahan believes that moment is now. I agree." Emily looked at the letter. She didn't move toward it immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something you recognize, even when you've never seen it before, with a recognition that is more physical than intellectual. It's addressed to you," Carter said. "I haven't read it." Emily reached forward. Her hands were steady. She picked up the letter and held it for a moment without unfolding it. Carter watched her the way a good officer watches a good soldier in a difficult moment, present, attentive, ready to respond to whatever came next, but not inserting himself into what wasn't his. She unfolded it. She read it. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly. Carter watched her face during the second reading. The professional composure that had been her constant companion for 2 days was present. But beneath it, something was happening that composure was designed to contain without extinguishing. She read it a third time. Then she folded it carefully along its original crease and held it in her hands. Carter waited. He says she started, then stopped. Started again. He says that the decision to recommend me for the designation was the easiest professional decision he ever made, and that he's making it now in these specific circumstances, because he wants to make sure the recommendation exists independent of what happens next. Her voice was steady and precise. He says the work is going to ask more of me than I've given anything yet, and that he knows I can give it. She paused. He says that being certain of that, of what I'm capable of, is the thing he's most sure of. More sure than anything else in the file he's leaving behind. Carter was quiet. "He ends with something he told me once in person," Emily said, "about the shot. He says, remember that it happens before you pull the trigger. That was always true. It will always be true. Make sure you've already won before you start." The office was completely quiet. Carter looked at Emily Hayes holding a letter from a dead man who had believed in her more completely than most people are believed in by anyone, and he understood something about the weight she carried that he had not understood before. It was not a burden. It was a standard. The heaviness of it was not grief, though grief was in it, but the weight of living up to the most complete act of faith another person had ever extended in your direction. That was a different kind of weight, and it required a different kind of strength. "Sergeant Hayes," Carter said quietly. She looked at him. "He was right about you," Carter said. "For what that's worth, from someone who took too long to see it, he was completely right." Emily looked at him for a moment. And then, for the first time since Carter had met her, through the weapons bay and the range and the conference room and all the contained, precise, uncomplicated interactions of the last 2 days, something in her face did something completely unrehearsed. She didn't cry. Emily Hayes did not cry in Carter's office, and Carter did not expect her to, and would not have registered it as weakness if she had. But something in her face opened briefly, in the way a window opens when someone finally reaches it after a long time in a closed room. Just a moment, just enough, then it closed again. "Thank you, sir," she said. Her voice was level, "for giving it to me." "Thank Callahan," Carter said. "I just carried it across the hall." A small something crossed her face that might, in different circumstances, have become a smile. At 1100, the thing that Carter had not planned for happened. Kowalski knocked on his door. Carter called him in, and Kowalski stood in the doorway with the expression of a man delivering news that he has spent the last 40 minutes deciding how to frame. "The rifle, sir," Kowalski said. The Barrett from Facility B. Carter looked at him. What about it? I ran the full post-demonstration diagnostic this morning. Standard protocol after an extreme-range live fire event. Kowalski paused. The recalibration I performed yesterday morning, the 0.003-degree correction. It held through the demonstration as expected, but, Carter said, there was clearly a but. The original deviation, the one Sergeant Hayes identified, from the footage I ran a backward analysis this morning, trying to determine the origin point. When the deviation first appeared, Kowalski looked at his boots for a fraction of a second. It originated approximately 3 weeks ago, sir, during the last scheduled maintenance cycle. Carter was very still. During maintenance, he said, yes, sir. Performed by? Kowalski cleared his throat. Standard maintenance was performed by the armory team, but the scope calibration on this specific rifle was flagged as a specialist task and was assigned separately. He paused. It was assigned to Corporal Davis, who completed the task and signed off on it. Carter looked at him, and the deviation appeared after Davis's calibration. After, sir, yes. Are you telling me, Carter said slowly, that the scope was miscalibrated during routine maintenance and the error was not caught by any subsequent inspection until Sergeant Hayes identified it from range footage during a briefing? Yes, sir. That's what I'm telling you. The implications of that sentence settled into the room like weather. If Emily had not gone into the weapons bay, if she had not identified the deviation before the demonstration, if the demonstration had proceeded with the miscalibrated scope, the round at 3,200 meters would have landed outside the target zone. And everyone watching Carter read, Whitmore, 30 other senior personnel would have walked away, believing that the badge was wrong, that Emily's record was inflated, that the impossible number was a classification error. Emily would have walked away from Raven Peak with her capability doubted and her record questioned, and nobody would have known the real reason the shot had missed. Carter stood up. He walked to his window. He stood there for a moment with his back to Kowalski. Where is Corporal Davis, he said. Scheduled for duty in the armory, sir. 1700. I want a full inspection report on every weapon system that Davis has had calibration responsibility for in the last 6 months, Carter said. On my desk by 1400. Yes, sir, and Kowalski. Sir, this conversation doesn't leave this building until I've reviewed the inspection report. Understood, sir. Kowalski left. Carter stood at his window and looked at the mountains and felt something cold moving through him that wasn't the Colorado air. The deviation in the scope had not been sabotage. He was not going to that conclusion. Kowalski had not suggested it, and Carter was not a man who jumped to dramatic explanations when simpler ones were available. The simplest explanation was an error. A calibration error made by a junior armorer who had signed off on work he hadn't fully completed or hadn't fully understood. But the consequence of that error, had Emily not identified it, would have been the destruction of a reputation and the burying of a capability that Tate had spent years cultivating and his last 13 days ensuring would not be lost. Carter thought about that for a long time. He thought about how many Emily Hayeses there might be in the military that he would never know about. Not because they didn't exist, because they had operated in environments where the equipment failed, or the conditions were wrong, or the person evaluating them used their own experience as the standard, and they had been measured and found wanting not by their actual capability, but by the gap between their capability and what the system around them was prepared to see. He thought about what he had said to Emily in the weapons bay. Who authorized you to touch that rifle? He thought about what she had said back. I authorized myself, sir. At 11:45, Reed found Carter still standing at the window. He had knocked and entered and correctly read the posture as one that did not require ceremony. You've heard, Carter said without turning around. Kowalski told me on his way back to the armory, Reed said. He wasn't apologetic about the information chain. That wasn't the moment for it. What do you make of it? Carter asked. Reed sat down in the chair across from Carter's desk. I make of it that we came within a scope calibration error of never knowing what we know now. He paused. And I make of it that Hayes walked into that weapons bay, violated protocol, faced your response, agreed to a demonstration, and the thing that made the demonstration possible was the violation that preceded it. The thing she did wrong protected the thing she did right, Carter said. Yes, sir. They were both quiet for a moment. I want to change something, Carter said. He turned from the window. In the way this base evaluates temporary assignment personnel. The protocol that Hayes violated, the restricted access protocol, I'm not changing that. The protocol is correct, but the evaluation process. The way we look at badges, records, classification levels. The automatic hierarchy of what we believe without verification. He stopped. I've been running this base on the assumption that my experience gives me an accurate read on what I'm looking at. Hayes showed me that experience is a starting point, not a conclusion. I want to build that into how we operate. Reed looked at him. That's a significant shift, sir. It's an accurate shift, Carter said, which is the only kind worth making. Reed thought for a moment. How do you propose? I want you to design it, Carter said. You spent 8 years in special forces. You've worked with elite operators. You know the difference between performance and capability better than most people on this base. I want a new evaluation framework for incoming personnel, temporary assignment, permanent assignment, both, based not on what their records say, but on what they actually demonstrate. He looked at Reed directly, and I wanted to account for the fact that some capabilities exist outside what we've personally seen before. Reed was quiet for a long moment. That's going to make some people uncomfortable, sir. Good, Carter said. Comfortable is how we missed the scope deviation for 3 weeks. Reed nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I'll start drafting today. At 13:15, Emily Hayes was with mess hall with Tanya Okafor when the news about the scope deviation reached general knowledge through the same unofficial channels that everything always reached general knowledge on a military base. Okafor heard it from Lieutenant Vasquez, who had heard it from someone in the armory, who had not been present for Kowalski's explicit instruction that the conversation not leave the building primarily, because that someone had heard the conversation from outside the building through a vent while working on an adjacent maintenance task. Okafor looked at Emily across their lunch trays. Did you know, Okafor asked, about the scope, about what would have happened if you hadn't corrected it? Emily was quiet for a moment. I knew the rifle needed to be corrected, she said. I didn't know the origin of the error, or that no one else had caught it. But if you hadn't gone into the weapons bay, then the demonstration would have failed for the wrong reason, Emily said. Okafor stared at her. You're very calm about the fact that an equipment error almost destroyed your career. Equipment errors happen, Emily said. The question is always whether someone catches them in time. She looked at Okafor. Tate taught me that. He said the most dangerous failures are the ones nobody sees until they matter. So you build the habit of seeing before they matter. Okafor sat back. She looked at Emily for a long time. He sounds like he was remarkable. Emily looked at her food. Something shifted in her face, the same brief opening Carter had seen, and then the same closing. He was, she said quietly. He was the best officer I ever served under. She paused. He used to say that the shot starts long before you pull the trigger, that the decision that matters is the one you make in the quiet before everything gets loud. She paused again. Going into that weapons bay was a quiet decision, made before everything got loud. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Were you scared, she asked, going in there, knowing what it would cost you? Emily picked up her coffee. I was focused, she said. When you're focused enough, scared gets quieter. Okafor absorbed that. I'm going to miss you, she said. When your temporary assignment ends. Emily looked at her. And something genuinely warm, not professional, not controlled, simply warm moved across her face. I'm not leaving immediately, Emily said, but you're leaving. Eventually. Emily held Okafor's gaze. Everyone leaves eventually. What matters is what you do with the time you're in the room. Looked at her tray, then looked back up. For what it's worth, she said, watching you in that weapons bay yesterday morning, watching you tell a 4-star general that you authorized yourself and not even blink was the most impressive thing I have ever seen in this building. And I've been here 2 years. Emily looked at her. It wasn't impressive, she said gently. It was just honest. There's a difference. Most people can't afford honest when a 4-star general is 2 feet from their face. Emily thought about that. Most people haven't been taught the right way to be afraid, she said. When you learn that fear is information rather than instruction, when you learn to use it instead of obey it, honest becomes easier. Not easy, she paused. Tate taught me that too. Outside, the Colorado wind was doing complicated things to the mountain air. Inside the mess hall, the ordinary operations of the base continued around them, voices, movement, the familiar sounds of a facility that had absorbed a significant event and was in the process of metabolizing it, the way organizations always metabolize significant events, slowly and incompletely, and in ways that would not become fully visible for months. But in the corner of the mess hall, at a small table with 2 lunch trays and 2 cups of coffee, something quieter and more permanent was happening. Emily Hayes was sitting with the letter from Aaron Tate folded in the breast pocket of her uniform, close to her heart, the way important things are kept close. And she was thinking about what it meant to be this far into something that someone else had seen long before she arrived at it. She was thinking about the shot that Tate had described, the one that starts before you pull the trigger, in the quiet, before everything gets loud. She was thinking about the fact that Tate had pulled his trigger 13 days before his death, that the letter in her pocket was the round he had fired. that it had been traveling toward her across time for more than 4 years. And it had arrived. Center mass. First shot. Exactly the way he had always said things worked when you were honest about the calculation and brave enough to trust it. 3 days passed after the letter. Not quietly. Nothing at Raven Peak passed quietly anymore, at least not in the way it had before Emily Hayes walked into Facility B and told a 4-star general she had authorized herself. But the 3 days had a different quality than the 48 hours that preceded them. The sharp edges of the incident had not softened exactly. They had settled, the way a bone settles after it heals stronger at the break than it was before, but carrying the memory of the fracture in its structure permanently. Carter felt it every morning when he reviewed his daily briefings. Something had changed in the way he read them. He was slower now, more deliberate. He found himself pausing at assessments he would previously have passed through without friction, the ones that felt obvious, the ones where the conclusion seemed to arrive before the evidence. He paused at those now and asked himself the question Emily had put in his head without ever stating it directly. What information do I not yet have? It was an uncomfortable question. He had decided to be comfortable with the discomfort. Reed felt it differently. He had spent 2 of the 3 days working on the evaluation framework. Carter had asked him to design, and what he discovered in the process of designing it was that the framework exposed gaps in his own thinking that he had not previously recognized as gaps. He had believed his special forces experience made him a reliable judge of exceptional capability. He still believed that. But he now understood the specific shape of the blind spot that experience had created, the way that having seen the best made it harder, not easier, to recognize a category of capability that existed past where the best you had personally seen stopped. He was building the framework to account for that blind spot. It was slow work. It was the most important work he had done in years. On the morning of the 3rd day, at 800 hours, Carter called a full officers' meeting. Not unusual, Carter ran weekly meetings with his senior staff as a matter of operational standard. But the agenda for this one had been distributed by Ortega the night before, with a single line under the heading New Business that made the rounds through the officer quarters in the specific way that single-line agenda items always made rounds, quietly, completely, and with significant attached speculation. The line read, Reassessment of Personnel Evaluation Protocols, Presenter Captain M. Reed. Lieutenant Vasquez read it at 2200 and spent 20 minutes explaining to Lieutenant Park what he thought it meant. Lieutenant Park, who had better instincts for these things, said, It means Hayes changed something. We're watching the change happen in real time. Vasquez thought about that. 1 soldier. Change the protocol. 1 soldier, Park said. 2 days and 33 years of Carter's certainty. That's the thing that actually changed. At the 800 meeting, Reed presented for 22 minutes. He had the framework printed and distributed, and he walked through it with the directness. That was his particular communication style, no preamble, no ceremony, no performance. Just the work and the reasoning behind it. The framework had 3 core components. The first was what Reed called the context-stripped evaluation, a protocol for assessing incoming personnel based solely on demonstrated behavior in real operational conditions, specifically designed to prevent rank, record, and prior reputation from front-loading the evaluation. The second was what he called the capability ceiling audit, a systematic process for identifying when an assessor's personal experience was functioning as a ceiling on what they could recognize rather than a floor. The third was a review mechanism, a process by which any evaluation conclusion rested primarily on the assessor's personal expertise rather than on observable evidence was flagged for secondary review. He presented all 3 without using Emily Hayes' name once. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood exactly where the framework had come from and exactly what had made it necessary. When he finished, Carter looked around the room. Questions. Colonel Whitmore spoke first. He had the particular posture of a man who had been carrying something uncomfortable for 3 days and had decided this was the moment to set it down. The context-stripped evaluation, he said, it changes how we handle temporary assignment personnel significantly. The current protocol gives them a lower default access tier precisely because we don't have full context on their backgrounds. Yes, Reed said. This framework essentially inverts that. It says we evaluate what they do rather than what we know about them. It says we don't let what we know about them prevent us from accurately evaluating what they do, Reed said. That's a distinction worth keeping. Whitmore absorbed that. The implication is that in some cases, someone with a lower visible record could be operating at a higher actual capability level than their access tier reflects. That's not an implication, Reed said evenly. That's a documented fact. It happened here 3 days ago in this building. The room was quiet for a moment. Carter watched Whitmore work through it. Whitmore was not a man who changed his framework easily. He was experienced, rigorous, and deeply committed to the structures that had shaped his career. Those were not weaknesses. They were the things that made him reliable under pressure and effective in complex operations. But they were also the things that had put him in the specific position of standing in Facility B 3 days ago and waiting to see how Carter would respond to a situation he didn't have the context to evaluate himself. That was the price of structure without examination. And Whitmore, to his credit, seemed to understand it. "I support the framework," Whitmore said finally. "I'd recommend a 90-day pilot before full implementation to identify gaps in the application." Reed nodded. "I agree, 90 days. Carter looked around the room. Other questions? There were 4 more, each one substantive, each one handled by Reed with the same direct precision he had brought to all of it. And when the last one was answered, Carter stood up and looked at his senior officers and said something that he had been composing, silently and carefully, since 2 in the morning. 3 days ago, a staff sergeant on temporary assignment violated protocol in a facility at this base. She did it knowingly, deliberately, and with a clear understanding of the consequences. Her reason for doing it was to correct an equipment error that would have invalidated a demonstration of her own capability. He paused. "In 33 years of military service, I have never encountered a more complete illustration of the difference between following a rule and understanding its purpose." He looked around the room slowly. "Protocol exists to protect capability. When I walked into Facility B and saw a junior soldier touching a restricted weapon, I enforced the protocol. That was correct. What was not correct was the assumption I made at the same moment that the protocol violation was evidence of incapacity rather than evidence of capability that the protocol didn't yet have a way to accommodate." He stopped, looked at his hands for a moment, then looked up. "I am changing how I evaluate what I see. I am asking each of you to do the same. Not because the standards are lower, because accurate standards require us to look further than our own experience and to be honest when what we're looking at is outside what we've personally seen before." The room was quiet when he finished. Then Colonel Whitmore, who had been in the military for 27 years and had attended hundreds of officers' meetings and heard hundreds of commanding officers speak, did something that Carter had never seen Whitmore do in the 3 years they had served together. He started the applause, not the automatic applause of a room performing respect for rank, the kind of applause that is specific and earned and means something real. It lasted 9 seconds. For a room full of military officers who expressed almost nothing through physical demonstration, 9 seconds was a very long time. Carter looked at his senior staff and accepted it with a nod that carried more in it than most people in the room could read. But Reed read it. Reed, who had spent enough time in small rooms with exceptional officers to know the difference between the nod of someone receiving approval and the nod of some receiving a correction they deserved and were grateful for. At 10:00, Carter went to find Emily. She was in the secondary training facility, a space that Raven Peak used for skills evaluation and technical instruction. She was not scheduled for anything in that room. She had apparently found it unlocked and available, and had taken the quiet of the empty space to work through something that Carter, standing in the doorway, took a moment to identify. She was dry firing, no ammunition, just the mechanics of the shot, repeated with the precision and deliberateness of someone not practicing technique. She was past the need to practice technique, but doing something more interior. Resetting. The way athletes return to fundamental movements, not because they've forgotten them, but because returning to them tells you something about where you are. Carter stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. "Then, Sergeant." She lowered the rifle immediately and turned. "Sir." He walked into the room. She set the rifle down on the table beside her and stood at ease in the instinctive way of someone who has been in the military long enough that posture adjusts automatically to context. Carter looked at her for a moment. "The officers' meeting went well," he said. "Reed presented the new evaluation framework. It was received." Emily said, "The word travels fast on this base." "It does." Carter paused. "I said some things in that meeting that I want to say to you directly as well." Emily waited. "I made a mistake when I walked into Facility B," Carter said. "Not the enforcement. The enforcement was correct. The mistake was the assumption that ran alongside the enforcement that what I was seeing was a junior soldier without the capacity to justify her own presence in that room." He held her gaze. "I have been in command for over a decade. I have made that mistake before, in smaller versions, with smaller consequences. This was the first time the consequences were large enough and clear enough that I couldn't rationalize them into something more comfortable." He paused. I'm grateful for that. I mean, that honestly. Emily looked at him. Sir, I'm not finished, Carter said not unkindly. I also want to say this. The evaluation framework that Reed is implementing came directly from watching you operate for 48 hours. It is going to change how this base looks at incoming personnel. It is going to change how we identify and protect capability that doesn't fit our existing frameworks. He paused. Tate wanted you to have this designation because he believed you were capable of the work. I believe that too now. But I also believe, and this is something Tate perhaps already knew, that the greater impact of what you carry is not what you can do with a rifle at 3,000 meters. It's what happens to the people who watch you do it. Emily was still. What you did here, Carter said, is going to matter to soldiers on this base for a long time. Not the shot. The decision to walk into that room and own it completely. He stopped. You changed something in this building and in the people in it. That's not a small thing. Emily looked at him for a long time. The same quality of looking that Carter had come to recognize, not performance, not calculation, the real thing. Tate used to say, she said finally, that the most important shots aren't the ones that travel the furthest. They're the ones that land in the right place at the right time. She paused. He meant it literally about the rifle, but I think he also meant it about everything else. Carter nodded. He sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was, Emily said. He made me better than I would have been without him. That's the best thing one person can do for another. The room held that for a moment. Then Carter looked at her with the direct, honest regard of someone who has finished the business of ceremony and arrived at something real. The designation processing is going to take approximately 30 days. Your temporary assignment at Raven Peak is formally extended through that period. He paused. Reed has asked that you work with him during that time on the evaluation framework. He wants your perspective on how to account for capability that exists outside the assessor's direct experience. Emily looked slightly surprised. The first time Carter had seen genuine surprise on her face. Captain Reed asked for me specifically, he said, and I'm quoting directly, she's the only person on this base who has both operated at that capability level and can articulate why other people can't see it. Carter paused. I agreed with him. Something moved across Emily's face. Something that Carter was fairly certain was the particular complicated emotion of being accurately seen by someone who had previously failed to see you, the thing that feels like relief and vindication and grief all at once, because it arrives with the weight of the time it took to arrive. Tell him yes, she said. At 1400 that same day, Reed and Emily sat across from each other in the secondary training facility with a draft of the evaluation framework on the table between them. Reed had been direct about it from the first sentence. I need you to break this, he said, sliding the draft across. Find the places where an assessor who thinks the way I thought 3 days ago would still miss someone who operates the way you operate. Emily read the framework. She read it the same way she read everything completely, once through fast, once through slow. Then she looked up. Section 2, she said, the capability ceiling audit. You're asking assessors to identify when their personal experience is functioning as a ceiling, but you're relying on self-reporting. Reed looked at her. That's accurate. Self-reporting is the weakest mechanism for identifying blind spots, Emily said. A blind spot, by definition, is not visible to the person who has it. You can't ask someone to identify their own blind spot reliably. You have to build external triggers that expose it without requiring the assessor to see it themselves first. Reed was quiet for a moment. What kind of external triggers? Specific questions built into the evaluation process. Not about the candidate, about the assessor's reasoning. She looked at the framework. For example, provide one example from your personal operational experience that is comparable to this candidate's demonstrated capability. If the assessor can't provide an example, that's a flag, not an automatic disqualification of the candidate, but a flag that the assessment may be operating outside the assessor's direct experience and requires secondary review. Reed looked at her. Then he picked up a pen and wrote that down in the margin without speaking. Section 3, Emily continued. The secondary review mechanism. You have it triggered by a flag on the primary assessment. That's good. But the secondary reviewer is drawn from the same peer pool as the primary assessor. Yes, which means the secondary reviewer is likely to have the same blind spots, Emily said. If the primary assessor can't recognize a capability because it's outside their experience, the secondary reviewer from the same peer pool is equally unlikely to recognize it. She paused. You need a mechanism to bring in reviewers who have experience in the specific capability domain being assessed. Not general excellence, the specific domain. Reed wrote that down too. They worked for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Emily found 9 places in the framework where the logic was sound, but the mechanism was insufficient. Reed corrected all 9. 3 of the corrections required him to fundamentally rethink sections he had considered finished. He did it without defensiveness, without the particular friction of someone protecting work they'd already decided was complete. He was doing what Emily had described to Okafor days earlier, using the discomfort as information rather than letting it become instruction. At 16:20, when they were done, Reed looked at the revised framework on the table between them. "This is significantly better than what I brought in," he said. "The structure was right," Emily said. "The mechanisms needed work." "You did the work. We did the work," Emily said. "How this goes. One person builds the structure. Another person pressure tests it. It's the same as the shot you calculate. You verify. You adjust. You fire." She paused. "Nobody does any of those steps alone." Reed looked at her for a moment. Then he said the thing he had been building toward for 2 hours. Not because the conversation had led him there, but because the conversation had given him permission. "Tate trained you for this too," he said. "Not just the shooting. This," he gestured at the table, "the way you move through a problem. The way you find the weak point without making the person who built the structure feel like they failed." Emily looked at the table for a moment. He used to run problem-solving sessions in the field. Real operational problems, not simulations. He'd present the situation and then just wait. He didn't correct anyone while they were thinking. He waited until the thinking was done and then asked one question. "What did you assume that you didn't verify?" She paused. 90% of the time, that question found the problem. Reed nodded slowly. "What did you assume that you didn't verify?" He said it was the most important question in any operation, in any decision, in any relationship. Emily looked at Reed directly. "You assumed the badge was inflated. You didn't verify what the badge actually represented." "I tried to verify it," Reed said. "I moved the target." "You tried to disprove it," Emily said gently. "That's different from verifying it. Verification means being equally open to either outcome. Trying to disprove is starting with the conclusion and looking for evidence." She paused. "Tate said that's the hardest habit to break because it feels like rigor. It presents itself as the scientific method, but it's actually just certainty wearing the clothes of methodology." Reed sat with that for a long time. "Carter said that to me this morning," he said finally. Almost those exact words. He'd written a note to himself. I saw it on his desk. Something about the depth of certainty not being the measure of accuracy. Emily looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. "He wrote that in a notepad. I saw it when I was leaving his office." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said softly. "That's good." At 18:30, the last scheduled event of the day was something that Carter had not originally planned and had decided on at noon after the officers' meeting and his conversation with Emily and his second read of Reed's revised framework. He had asked Ortega to arrange an informal gathering in the main briefing room at 1800. Not a ceremony, not a formal event. He had been explicit about that. An informal gathering. Attendance voluntary. 41 people showed up. The entire senior officer staff. Most of the specialist personnel who had been at the range demonstration. Kowalski, Okafor, Vasquez, and Park. Every person whose understanding of something important had been changed by the last 72 hours. Carter stood at the front of the room without notes. He looked at the 41 people. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "We've had enough words in the last 3 days. What I want to do is say one thing clearly, so that it's said in a room full of people who were here for all of it." The room was quiet. Staff Sergeant Emily Hayes came to this base as a temporary assignment soldier, with a classified record and a badge that described a capability most of us had never personally witnessed. He paused. "She walked into a restricted facility, handled a classified weapon, and told me she authorized herself. She submitted to a demonstration at conditions that were deliberately made harder than what she'd been told to expect. She took a shot that 32 of us watched, with the specific posture of people who are not certain they believe what they're about to see." He stopped. "And she has spent the last 3 days doing something that most people with her capability would never do. She used what she knows to make the system around her better. Not for credit, not for recognition, because that's what good soldiers do with good capability." He looked around the room slowly. "I asked her at some point in the last 3 days what the shot at Clearwater meant to her. She said it was never about the distance. It was about the people on the other side of it." He paused. "I think that's the truest thing I've heard in this building in a long time. And I think it applies to more than a rifle." He looked at Emily, who was standing at the side of the room with Okafor, and had the specific expression of someone who is trying to be professionally composed about something that is making professional composure difficult. "So this is me. On the record, in a room full of witnesses. I was wrong in that weapons bay. The badge was accurate. The soldier was right. And the only reason this base is better today than it was 3 days ago is because she walked through a door she wasn't supposed to and told the truth about why. The room was quiet for a full 3 seconds. Then Okafor started the applause. Loudly, without restraint, the way Okafor did most things. The room followed her. Emily stood at the side of the room and took it with the specific kind of stillness that was not detachment, but the opposite of detachment, of fullness. The expression of someone receiving something that has come a long way to reach them. She thought about Aaron Tate, about 14 pages written in the last 13 days of a life, about a letter traveling across 4 years to land center mass, exactly where it had been aimed. She thought about the shot at Clearwater, about the team lead who had looked at the calculation and said he couldn't disprove it, about 6 soldiers in one window and the physics of what becomes permanent the moment you commit to it. She thought about what Tate had told her about the space between the decision and the trigger, the where everything that mattered already existed before the bullet did. She thought about walking into Facility B 3 days ago, about the decision made in the quiet before everything got loud. And she understood, standing in this room with 41 people who had all changed something true about themselves in the last 72 hours, that the shot she had fired in that weapons bay, the decision, the commitment, the willingness to stand in front of a 4-star general and own every word of what she had done, had landed exactly where she had aimed it. Not in the target, in the people, in Carter's notebook, in Reed's framework, in the 9 corrections to a document that was going to change how this base evaluated the next Emily Hayes, and the one after that and the one after that. In the room full of people who would carry something different out of this building than they had carried in. Tate had taught her that the most important shots aren't the ones that travel the furthest. They're the ones that land in the right place at the right time. 3 days ago, at Raven Peak Military Base in Colorado, a 23-year-old staff sergeant had walked into a room she wasn't supposed to enter, picked up a rifle she wasn't supposed to touch, and changed the trajectory of every person who had been standing close enough to see it happen. The distance wasn't 3,200 meters. The distance was 33 years of certainty, converted by honesty, by precision, and by the specific courage of someone who had been taught that the shot starts long before you pull the trigger into something more accurate than it had ever been before. That was the miracle nobody saw coming, and it was the one that lasted.